Some of the most dangerous cults in history didn't look like cults. They looked like self-help groups, spiritual retreats, and family communities. They operated in plain sight, in wealthy suburbs, in respectable neighborhoods, attended by lawyers and professors and business people who would have been offended if you called them cult members. Before we start, if you're drawn to these real, documented cases, subscribe and hit the bell. What I'm about to share isn't speculation. Every detail comes from court records, federal investigations, and first-hand testimony. 4 cases that prove cults aren't always in the jungle or on some remote compound. Sometimes they're right next door. In the late 1990s, if you were a successful professional in Albany, New York, or Vancouver, or Mexico City, and you felt that your potential wasn't being fully realized, someone might have handed you a brochure. It looked like a corporate leadership program. It promised techniques to overcome psychological limitations, to improve relationships, to become the person you were meant to be. The courses were expensive, thousands of dollars for a 16-day intensive, but the testimonials were compelling. People swore their lives had changed. Prominent names were attached to it. And the founder, a man named Keith Raniere, was described in the materials as one of the smartest people alive, with a tested IQ in the top 1% of the population. There are things reason cannot explain. This is one of them. NXIVM, pronounced NXIVM, operated from 1998 to 2018 as a multi-level marketing company selling personal development seminars. Its real function, the function that emerged over 20 years of operation and was finally exposed by a New York Times investigation in 2017, was far darker. At the center of NXIVM was a secret subgroup called DOS, an acronym from the Latin Dominus Obsequious Sororium, Master over Slave Women. DOS operated on a master-slave hierarchy. Women were recruited into DOS by other women who were already members, told it was a women's empowerment group. They were then required to provide collateral, material that could destroy their lives if revealed. Photographs, signed false confessions, videos. All of this was kept by Raniere as insurance against anyone who tried to leave. And then there was the branding. Women who reached a certain level in DOS were brought to a ceremony. They were told to lie on a table, and with a medical cauterizing pen, a doctor who was also a member of the group burned Raniere's initials into their skin while they screamed. Raniere reportedly called in by phone to check whether those performing the branding were doing it hard enough. Among NXIVM's most prominent members were Sarah and Claire Bronfman, heiresses to the Seagram liquor fortune, who bankrolled the organization with tens of millions of dollars. One of NXIVM's most visible recruiters was Allison Mack, an actress best known for the television series Smallville. Mack recruited women into DOS, serving as a master who collected their collateral and channeled their obedience upward to Raniere. Listen to what Camila, identified only by her first name to protect her identity as a crime victim, said during Raniere's sentencing in 2020. She was 15 years old and a virgin when Raniere first raped her. He screwed with my mind for so long. He manipulated me psychologically to the point where I cut off my friends and my family so I could be his alone. He told me that was spiritual development, that letting go of attachments was growth. I believed him. I was 15. I thought he was teaching me. By the time I understood what he was doing to me, I had lost 12 years. I was isolated. I was brainwashed. I had his initials burned into my skin. And I am here today, not because I am not afraid of him. I am still afraid of him. I am here because getting my voice back is the only way to begin to undo what he did. In June 2019, a federal jury convicted Raniere on all counts: sex trafficking, forced labor conspiracy, human trafficking, and racketeering. He was sentenced to 120 years in federal prison. More than 100 victim impact statements were submitted to the court. The FBI estimated that during NXIVM's 20 years of operation, roughly 18,000 people paid for its courses. Most of them never knew about DOS, but the few hundred who did paid with their freedom, their dignity, and in some cases, with permanent scars on their bodies. And if NXIVM represents the cult that hid inside corporate America, the next case represents something that should have been impossible in a modern Western democracy. The systematic kidnapping of babies and children, kept for years and missed by authorities for decades. Hamilton-Byrne was an Australian yoga teacher who, in the 1960s, became convinced that she was the reincarnation of Jesus. By the early 1970s, she had gathered a devoted following of professionals, doctors, lawyers, nurses, psychiatrists who believed her claims and financed her operation. She called her group The Family, and it was based in a compound outside of Melbourne. There are things reason cannot explain. This is one of them. What made The Family unique among cults was Hamilton-Byrne's obsession with children. Between the 1960s and the early 1980s, she acquired at least 28 children through a combination of legal adoption, illegal arrangements with complicit doctors and social workers, and in some cases, direct kidnapping. These children were raised on the compound, isolated from the outside world, and subjected to a regime that is difficult to describe as anything other than systematic abuse. All the children had their hair dyed the same shade of platinum blonde. They were dressed in identical uniforms. They were told they were the children of Jesus, specifically that Anne Hamilton-Byrne was their spiritual mother, and that they had been selected to survive the coming apocalypse. They were given new names. Contact with their biological families was forbidden. Adults outside the compound addressed them as Anne Hamilton-Byrne's children. The children were subjected to regular sessions of what the group called ego destruction, isolation in dark rooms, starvation, beatings. They were administered prescription tranquilizers and, on occasions, the group described as spiritual initiations, LSD. Listen to what Sarah Moore, a survivor who was raised in the family under a different name and has since changed her identity, told investigators after the 1987 police raid that finally exposed the compound. There was no outside. We didn't know there was an outside. Anne was God. She told us that. The adults confirmed it constantly. We were her special children, born to lead the world after the apocalypse. The drugs were part of the program. They told us they were vitamins, or sometimes they told us they were sacred medicines. I didn't know what LSD was. I didn't know what tranquilizers were. I only knew that after taking them, the world looked different, and that the adults said that was God touching us. I was an adult before I understood that what happened to me was abuse. In the compound, it was love. That's what made it survivable, and also what made it impossible to escape. We were loved in the most damaging way anyone can be loved. The compound was raided by Australian Federal Police in August 1987. Hamilton-Byrne fled to the United States, where she lived for years before being extradited. She was ultimately convicted only of falsifying birth certificates, a result that her survivors described as a catastrophic failure of justice. She died in 2019. Many of the 28 children she collected spent their adult lives reconstructing identities that had been stolen from them before they were old enough to form memories. And if Anne Hamilton-Byrne represents the cult that hid behind the appearance of a loving community, the next case represents something darker still. A cult that didn't just abuse its own members, but entered into a formal working relationship with a military dictatorship to torture and kill dissidents. Colonia Dignidad was established in 1961 in a remote valley in central Chile by Paul Schaefer, a German lay preacher who had fled West Germany while facing child molestation charges. He brought with him a group of around 300 German followers, deeply religious people who believed they were building a model Christian community in the Chilean countryside. There are things reason cannot explain. This is one of them.
From the outside, Colonia Dignidad looked like a success story. The compound was immaculate. The Germans were efficient, hard-working, clean. They built a hospital and a school that served the surrounding Chilean community for free. Local families sent their children to study there. Politicians visited and praised the example of German industriousness in the Chilean South. Inside, Schaefer ran a totalitarian miniature state. Members worked from dawn to dusk for no pay. Families were separated. Men, women, and children lived in different quarters and had limited contact. Mail was censored. Movement outside the compound required Schaefer's permission. And members were administered daily psychopharmaceutical drugs, medications disguised as vitamins for health or spiritual purposes that kept them in a state of diminished will and compliance. Schaefer raped boys, systematically, for decades. The children who lived inside Colonia Dignidad were his captive targets. Their parents, many themselves victims of his conditioning, were unable to protect them. When Augusto Pinochet's military junta seized power in Chile in September 1973, Schaefer saw an opportunity. Colonia Dignidad became one of DINA's secret detention centers, the Chilean secret police's facilities for interrogating, torturing, and disappearing political opponents of the regime. Prisoners were brought to the compound, held in underground cells, tortured with methods that DINA agents and Schaefer's men developed together, and in many cases executed and buried in the compound's grounds. Listen to what Luis Marchant, a Chilean political prisoner who was detained in Colonia Dignidad in 1975 and survived, said in testimony to the Retting Commission, Chile's truth and reconciliation process. Here's what Luis Marchant said. Listen to Luis's testimony. They brought me there at night. I didn't know where I was. It smelled of fields, of Germany, which made no sense to me. I was put in a room underground. The torture was methodical, not chaotic. Someone had thought about it carefully. Between sessions, there were men who spoke German to each other. I could see through a gap that some of them wore the same style of clothes you might see in a European village. Suspenders, wool trousers. They were settlers, farmers, and they were participating in what was happening to me. When I finally understood where I had been, years later, that it was a German religious convent, it was the most disturbing thing I had ever learned, because it meant that Schaefer had taken people who came to Chile to build a Christian community, and he had turned them into instruments of a dictatorship's torture program. And most of them believed they were doing God's work. Schaefer fled Chile in 1997 when Chilean authorities finally issued a warrant for him in 2005. He was captured in Argentina in 2005, extradited, and sentenced to 20 years for sexual abuse. He died in a Chilean prison in 2010 at the age of 88. Chilean investigators found hidden weapon caches containing 92 machine guns, over 100 rifles, thousands of grenades, and surface-to-air missiles. They also found files on hundreds of victims of the Pinochet regime, buried in the compound's potato cellar, the same room where the torture took place. The full extent of who was killed and buried in Colonia Dignidad's grounds has never been established. Excavations are still ongoing. And to close with a case that proves these dynamics are not historical anomalies but living, ongoing phenomena, I have to tell you about a cult that operated almost entirely on the internet, whose leader declared herself the 19th reincarnation of Jesus Christ and Mother God simultaneously, and whose final chapter is one of the most disturbing scenes in the history of online radicalization. Amy Carlson founded Love Has Won in 2008 as a small spiritual community in Colorado, initially organized around basic New Age beliefs. Over the years, increasingly isolated from mainstream society and increasingly dependent on the feedback loop of her growing online following, Amy Carlson's claims escalated. She declared herself not just spiritually enlightened, but literally the incarnation of God, the 19th reincarnation of Jesus Christ, the channel through which all of humanity's healing would flow. There are things reason cannot explain. This is one of them. The group live-streamed everything. Hours of video every day, available to followers around the world who donated money, sent packages, and treated Carlson as a divine being. In the videos, Carlson drank colloidal silver, a substance that, when consumed in large quantities, turns human skin permanently blue-gray, a condition called argyria. Her skin was visibly discolored in her later videos. She also consumed massive amounts of alcohol and what followers called blessed ashes, a substance that was never clearly identified. By 2021, Carlson was dying. Her organs were failing. The people around her, core members who lived with her physically, watched this happen in real time, live streaming it to their audience, who continued to donate. Some members believed she would ascend and come back. Some believed her suffering was a spiritual sacrifice. None of them called a doctor. When Amy Carlson died in April 2021, her followers did not call emergency services immediately. Instead, they wrapped her body in Christmas lights, painted it with glitter, and dressed it in ceremonial clothing. A week later, police in Moffat County, Colorado, received a tip and found her mummified remains in a mobile home. Her eyes had been left open. Her body had been displayed. Listen to what Andrew Profici, a former member who had joined Love Has Won in 2018 and left in 2020, told investigators. "I know how it sounds from outside, I know. But when you're inside, the logic builds so gradually that you never see the leap. Every step makes sense given the step before it. Amy would say something that sounded insane, and then she would spend 3 hours explaining why it wasn't insane, and by the end, you believed her, and you wanted to believe her, because she offered something that nothing else offers: absolute certainty. In a world where nothing is certain, she was completely certain. She was God, she said so. And if you doubted that, you doubted yourself, because clearly you weren't spiritually evolved enough to perceive the truth. That's the trap. And by the time I got out, I had given them thousands of dollars, I had cut off my family, and I had spent 2 years live streaming a woman drinking herself to death, while we called it a spiritual journey." 7 members of Love Has Won were arrested in connection with Carlson's death on charges of abuse of a corpse and child abuse. Their trial brought global attention to the question of what constitutes criminal responsibility when the actions happen within a religious framework. The Love Has Won website and affiliated social media channels continued operating after Carlson's death, maintained by followers who believe she will return. If you made it to the end, leave a comment telling me which case disturbed you most: NXIVM, the family, Colonia Dignidad, or Love Has Won. And if you know of other documented cases like these, share the video. See you in the next one.